Hello everyone, and welcome to Evaluating Website Accessibility. I'm Joanne Rowe here at TXVSN, and I'll be your host for today. We also have Joy as an aide and Becky as our captionist, and when we go to our breakout rooms, I'll be in room 1, Joy will be room 2, and Becky will be room 3 when we break out for our activities. Our presenter today is Jared Smith from WebAIM, and before I kick it off to him, I'd like to let you know about a few things if you've never been on a webinar before. We have the chat window in the left, and you can break that off and move it to where you need to. I have it on 2 screens, so I put it on another screen to clear up some room, and so I can see the participant window. So you see your name there in the participant window, and then underneath there are 4 little squares, one for emoticon, so you can use that if you're LOLing or if Jared asks a question and he needs you to thumbs up or thumbs down, like a yes, no, or if he's going too fast or too slow and you want him to go faster or slower. If you need to leave the room, there's a step away icon. The raise hand is there. If you need to have him stop and ask a question, it'll go, your name will go red, and so Jared will know to stop and address your question. And then there's a little check icon, and that's where our responses will be if he asks you a question. Like, give me a green check if you have done this, or X if you have not, and that's where you will do that. And so again, I'd like to welcome you. And now I would like to kick it off to Jared, who is our presenter. So Jared, I hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. As was mentioned, I would encourage you, if you have questions or comments along the way, please just post those down in the chat window, and I'll be monitoring that, and we'll try to address those as we go through the day today. I see there are at least a few people here that were in my sessions yesterday. I had one on the user experience of accessibility and also on HTML accessibility, and so there will be a little bit of overview or an overlap between the content from yesterday and today. Not much, but just a little bit, because we're going to be talking about a lot of the same principles, but from a different perspective of evaluation. So we're just going to dive right into this. Just a bit of a disclaimer here. This session will not be an introduction to web accessibility. We are going to focus on evaluating web accessibility with a bit of an assumption that you have some understanding of at least the principles of what web accessibility is and what it means. It's also not going to be a highly technical session. We're not going to be talking about in-depth code or accessibility APIs and operating system level evaluation with complex tools. It's going to be pretty basic, not necessarily basic, but evaluation that's really pretty straightforward that anybody can do with an understanding of accessibility to best evaluate true accessibility for end users. So what it will present today are web accessibility evaluation methodologies. So just a process and tools and resources that you can use for evaluation, and some best practices, and with a real focus on end user accessibility and also on compliance. So I'm going to start with this question for you. When in the design or development process should you begin accessibility evaluation? This is a question we get quite often. And it's an important question, I think, as to when's the best point? When should you start this? Quite frequently, Dr. Monty Tatum says at the very beginning, yes, and that really is the best answer. Quite often we will have clients that will contact us here at WebAIM, and the conversation will often go something like this. We've been working on this site for a year. We're going to be launching it next week. We're wondering if you might be able to give us an accessibility evaluation before we launch next week. that usually is not a good point in time to start considering accessibility. Yeah, very, very early in the design planning stage is the best place to begin, at least considering accessibility. Actual evaluation can begin in early structure mock-ups, before you even get to visual mock-ups. When you're thinking of the structure and navigation structure of a site, how many pages you're going to have, what they're going to be titled, how they're going to link together. You can start accessibility there to at least some extent. When you get to the graphical design stage, then it becomes a little more necessary. You can evaluate things like size of text and contrast. You can identify things that may be problematic once they begin to be coded up, things like reading in navigation order. We often with clients will have a graphical mock-up, and we'll put little numbers all over it, all over this interface that'll say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so forth, that will identify the reading and navigation order, or we'll draw arrows that outline that reading and navigation order. That way, when that mock-up is handed over to a development team, they can sit down and code that in that particular process. I just want to stop real quick. There's somebody on. There's just a little bit of background noise there. I'm not sure if somebody maybe needs to mute their microphone. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but just a little bit of distracting noise there. Thanks. And of course, once you begin coding things up very early in that process, accessibility should be a significant part of that process. Retrofitting for accessibility is always going to be more difficult and more expensive than designing it from the ground up. We find that all the time in the work that we do. And when clients come to us and say, yeah, we're beginning the design of this page, how can you, or of this site, how can you help us with accessibility? Typically with just a little bit of technical assistance early in that process, and then a little evaluation along the way to head off things that may be problematic, and a little bit of education. The cost and effort of ending up with a highly accessible product, it just works so much better. Whereas when we get those calls that we're launching next week, often there's not a lot that we can do if there's very little accessibility implemented. It's really hard for us to even help at that point. We can identify accessibility issues, and often they're quite significant and numerous. But then we're kind of putting accessibility lipstick on a usability page is a phrase I like to use a lot, where it doesn't matter if how much lipstick you put on it. If it's still a usability and accessibility page, it's always going to be a page. And so we want to, with accessibility, make sure it doesn't turn into a page, and we do that early in the process. When we consider accessibility, we want to consider the end user experience, which I really would call accessibility. That's really what it's about, is the human experience. And also compliance. Compliance and standards and guidelines outline technical specifications and thresholds to which we're supposed to meet. And accessibility guidelines have various levels, and they're different types, and some are old and some are newer, and they all are imperfect. But they are very helpful in that they give us a definition, a technical specification for accessibility. So we always like to say that accessibility is more important than compliance. We will take and favor the end user experience over technical code and interaction compliance any day. It doesn't matter if it's compliant if the end user experience is poor. And I would argue that the inverse is true. If it's a positive and accessible user experience, does it really matter if it's compliant or not? I don't know. It's an interesting question, but we'll always take accessibility over that. We also have this interesting dilemma sometime, or issue that comes up, of technical accessibility versus functional accessibility, where you can actually follow the rules and make something that's technically accessible and standards compliant, yet still result in an end user experience that is not functionally very friendly or efficient or accessible at all. In other words, you can be totally compliant yet totally inaccessible. And it's not very often that we see that. Certainly the technical specifications and compliance lend themselves to a good user experience. They just do not guarantee it. That's why we do evaluation, and why our approach to evaluation is really focused on true end user experience. And then we use those the technical specifications and standards to help us get there. I think I've pretty much said this, that accessibility really is about the human experience, and because of that, only humans can adequately evaluate true accessibility. Now, there are some great tools and resources that are out there, but a computer cannot tell whether something actually is accessible. It can't evaluate what that experience is going to be. When we consider accessibility guidelines, computers just can really only check a very small portion of those. In fact, I'm not sure how many WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, how many level A or level AA success criteria there are. Probably 30, something like that. I'll explain this in a little more depth in a minute, but there is at most one of those 30 or so that can be fully evaluated by a computer process, meaning it can tell you for sure whether it passes or fails. And that's one of those. Automated systems are very limited in what they can do, and I'll revisit that a little bit more here later. So a little bit of a methodology. I don't want to call this a process or a checklist for accessibility, because these aren't things you would do, do this first, do this second, do this third. It's a lot of resources and ideas that you can use in evaluation. But the first of these is use a checklist. So checklists can be really helpful in evaluating accessibility. Now, I just spent several minutes talking about the limitations of accessibility guidelines and standards and how they can't ensure accessibility, but they lend themselves to accessibility. And so a checklist can really be pretty helpful. There are some URLs there, and you can check those out later. But one was a blog post that was written talking about checklist accessibility as being harmful to the user experience. Meaning, if all that people did was go through a checklist and check these boxes, that doesn't necessarily result in an accessible experience, and that's very true. And there's kind of a counter argument there that says, hey, checklists really can be valuable. Of course, they don't do everything, but checklists can be helpful. So we recommend using a checklist that's based on accessibility standards. So as we look at our standards, there's WCAG 1.0, and it actually didn't carry over into this system with the PowerPoint, but I actually, on my slides, I have WCAG 1.0. It's stricken out. So even though that shows us the bullet here on the original slides, it's like shown with a big X there, right? We would not recommend using WCAG 1.0 specifications. They're significantly outdated at this point. They were authored in 1999, so it gives you an idea of how dated they are. But it is important to note that standards and guidelines are not new. We've had these for 15 years now. So we have an idea of what things should be implemented into a checklist, and we've had these for a long time. There's Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the WebAIM site has a checklist for Section 508. So it lists the technical requirement in Section 508, and then lists basically what we believe or interpret that to mean, what you would need to do in order to either pass that particular checkpoint of Section 508, or if your site does these things, it probably fails. So we have a checklist that can be of real help to you. One thing to keep in mind with Section 508 is it is also very dated. It was finalized in 2001. Think about what you were doing on the web in 2001. probably not a lot of the things that you're doing today weren't even possible in 2001. So it is quite dated, a very minimal standard. Probably the most important thing I can say about Section 508 is that you can be fully Section 508 compliant, yet very, or entirely inaccessible. And Joanne says MySpace in 2001. Yeah, I don't know. That might even predate. 2001 might even predate that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sarah says, yeah, hearing about 1999 being dated makes me feel old. Yeah, me too. But on the web, that was like ancient, right? On the web, 1999 was a long time ago when you consider the innovation on the web. And you know, WCAG 1.0, I sometimes say it's like the Model T Ford days of the web. You know, Section 508 would be, you know, I mean that's a long time ago too. So anyway, we just need to consider the implications of these standards. Section 508 has 16 checkpoints is all that apply to web content. There are also other standards in Section 508 that apply to software and plugins, things like that, that may be relevant to the things that you're doing, especially if you're building a web application. Is it a web page or is it software? And usually it's, sometimes things are more software, and so you may need to look beyond just the web checkpoints of Section 508. But there are only 16 of them. They're quite dated, and some of them really are not very relevant. In fact, I can even argue that implementing some of the current Section 508 checkpoints could actually make a website less accessible. So you need to know what you're doing there. Next we have WCAG 2.0, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.0, finalized in 2008, so much more up to date. Already starting to show its age a little bit. The idea with WCAG 2.0 was that it is more principles-based. As technology would change, the principles-based guidelines would still apply, and that's worked pretty well. It has a good shelf life, but there are a few things there that the applicability of these now 6-7-year-old guidelines are just not terribly applicable. So some consideration is necessary there as well. Or there's a customized checklist where you might take portions of the WCAG 2.0 guidelines, probably at a minimum the level A requirements, maybe some of the level AA requirements, or all of them. But you might include other things as well into a checklist for accessibility. You may consider some of the things that these guidelines do not cover. One example is text size. In WCAG 2.0, you can have 1 pixel text size and it's fully compliant. Nobody can read it, but it's fully compliant in WCAG 2.0. It's just an area that it doesn't address for some reason. So you may want to identify things like that and include them in your own checklist for evaluation. When we at WebAIM conduct evaluations on websites, we use WCAG 2.0 as a guide, but we also go well beyond those guidelines in identifying accessibility issues that are not strict compliance issues. It is important to know the limitations of guidelines. First, they're quite subject to interpretation. This is in many ways very applicable even to version 2.0 of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Because they're more principles-based, they use this kind of ethereal, fuzzy, sometimes confusing language that is not technology-specific. And the problem is when you're doing evaluation in a technology. When you're building accessibility, you're doing it in a specific technology, and it can sometimes be hard to know, well, what is this very fuzzy principles-based language? What does it mean I have to do in a technology? And that's probably the bulk of the information that's available on the WebAIM site, and the information we provide in trainings is bridging that gap between what the technical guidelines are telling you should do in this kind of fuzzy, weird language and what that means in a particular technology. It's also important to note that the guidelines do not address all aspects of accessibility. They don't address all types of disabilities. That's especially true for cognitive and learning disabilities because they're so varied and because there's potential even for conflict in the needs of users with various types of cognitive or learning disabilities. The guidelines just simply don't do a whole lot there. If they do, they're generally requirements that are relegated to like AAA level. An example of one is it says your page should be readable by somebody that has a lower secondary reading level. That's a great idea. You know, your page should probably be readable by somebody that has, you know, kind of middle school, junior high, lower high school reading level. That makes sense, right? That would be good for most content. It would not, however, be perfectly applicable to all content. Your college chemistry class would probably be less accessible if it were written at a middle school level. But you do want to consider the spirit of that, make things as readable and understandable as is appropriate to that content. So just know that a lot of usability type things, cognitive aspects of accessibility are not addressed in the guidelines, but can have a huge impact on the end user experience. Also the guidelines, as I mentioned, are somewhat dated. They lag behind technology innovation, especially WCAG 1.0 and Section 508. However, Section 508 is in the process of being updated. As before, the strikeouts in all of these dates did not carry over in the PowerPoint conversion. Yeah, we anticipated updates to Section 508 in 2006, and then in 2007 and 8 and 9 and so forth, and the updates still have not come. We anticipate those perhaps next year, but I've been saying that for almost a decade. I was part of an advisory committee that delivered a draft set of technical update guidelines to the federal government in 2006, and were promised at that time that there would be quick adoption and update of those, and it's now been almost 9 years since we completed our work there. So that's the federal government at work, but keep that in mind when you look at Section 508. We here at WebAIM do very, very little Section 508 work anymore. If somebody comes to us and says, we want a Section 508 evaluation, we say, no, you don't. We're only going to provide guidance that goes well beyond Section 508. That we'd be doing a disservice to our clients and to to people with disabilities that they serve if we were to limit our recommendations only to Section 508. And that's somewhat unfortunate that we haven't seen any updates to these guidelines in such a long time. Okay, just a little bit more insight into WCAG 2.0, and then we're going to let you go explore and look at WCAG 2.0 itself a little bit more. As I mentioned, it's very principles-based. At the core foundational level in WCAG 2.0 are principles. The 4 core principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. If you were in the session yesterday, we spent some time talking about POUR, poor websites, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Under those 4 principles are guidelines. Guidelines say things like provide alternative text, don't cause seizures, make things keyboard accessible, just broad statements and guidelines. And then below guidelines are success criteria. Success criteria is where the rubber meets the road. That's where actual conformance or compliance with WCAG 2.0 is measured. Success criteria are more measurable. They still use some kind of fuzzy, weird, confusing language so as not to be technology specific. But that's really where you need to look in order to evaluate true compliance with WCAG 2.0. Success criteria are each given a level A, level AA, or level AAA measure. So level A, if you don't do these things, you almost certainly are excluding users from your site. Level AA success criteria, if you don't do those, people with disabilities will likely have more difficulty or take more time or have confusion. in accessing your content, and then level AAA are more kind of a wish list of accessibility, more enhancements to accessibility that is already pretty good if you meet level A and level AA. That's not to say that we should ignore AAA success criteria. Just understand that many of them are quite very burdensome, very difficult to implement, and or may have applicability only to a rather narrow audience of users with disabilities. So there really are very, very few websites on the planet that are fully WCAG 2.0 level A, AA, and AAA compliant. Even the webaim.org site, we've certainly tried to implement a lot of accessibility, but it's not fully AAA compliant, and that doesn't mean it's inaccessible. It just means that we have not, we've chosen not to implement some of those more burdensome or difficult aspects of accessibility. An example of a AAA requirement is you must implement a sign language alternative version of all multimedia. So if you have a video that contains any audio, you must provide a video that includes somebody signing all of the audio content. Yeah, that could be helpful to some users with auditory disabilities that prefer seeing sign language over reading captions or a transcript, which are required at higher levels, but very, very expensive to generate a sign language version. So our videos, we don't have those. We've just chosen not to. So very few sites that meet all of those. But it's important to understand this this structure. So we're going to go into our first activity here. We're going to break into our individual rooms. I would invite all of you to open up the checklist. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer here on this WCAG 2.0 checklist, and you'll see a lot of stuff at the top of this that's all disclaimer stuff at the top of that page. Most of that was added at the request of the W3C, so as to not cause confusion. This is our interpretation of WCAG 2.0 as it relates only to HTML web content. Okay, so what you see here is not the actual language of WCAG 2.0. It's not fully encompassing of everything that may be required to meet the requirements of each success criteria. It is, however, a lot more consumable and understandable than going to WCAG 2.0 itself. So we invite you to open that up. There is the PDF version as well. If you don't go to the website, Connie just sent the PDF version. You can look at it. It's maybe a little easier to get through. So just keep that in mind with the checklist, but it should cover everything in WCAG 2.0. Beyond the success criteria, there are several hundred pages, like 800 pages, printed pages of supporting material that help define what all of these things mean. Really what we've done is we've taken those 800 pages and tried to boil it down to 4 or 5 pages. A quick checklist that tells you what the success criteria is and what the requirements are to meet that success criteria. So with that, we'll go ahead and break up into the rooms. So really what we want you to do, it'll kind of be up to the facilitators as to how they handle that. They can go through it individually. We just want you with this checklist to go through and look at it, maybe use it to conduct some evaluation on a site or a site that you're familiar with. And if you have questions about what you're seeing in WCAG 2.0, you probably will. Just note those, and when we come back into the main room, we'll give a few minutes to address any questions you might have about WCAG 2.0 itself. So with that, we'll break to our breakout rooms.
All right, moderators, I'm about to break you in. Remember to move yourself into your breakout room, and I'm about to do it. I'm sorry, Sarah. Did you get kicked out? What room were you in?
It never put me in a room. froze up and kicked me out, so I don't know where I was supposed to be. Connie,
Yes, ma'am.
did you hear me?
No?
I do not know what's going on with my computer. It froze up when they originally split us out, and then I had to reboot and come back in, so I'm not sure which lab I should be in.
It won't matter what lab you go in. I'd pick lab 2 or lab 3, though, because they have less numbers.
Okay, do I just double click on the...
No, click on your name and drag it to the room you want to go to.
Sounds great. Make sure you all just move yourselves back to the main room.
All right, everyone should be back to the main room now that the activity session is over. And Jared, I will hand it back over to you.
Okay, there we go. I had to unmute my phone. Sorry about that. I'm here. Hopefully you can all hear me. Hopefully that was a good activity. It was not anticipated that you would get a full in-depth understanding of WCAG 2.0 in those 12 minutes. We sometimes, as part of our training, will spend half a day talking about principles and technical implementation of accessibility, then another half day simply talking about nuances and complexities of WCAG 2 and understanding what it means and how you implement and evaluate to WCAG 2.0. But hopefully that provided a good overview of WCAG 2.0. I do want to stop if there and give a minute if there are any questions that you have about anything that you read or saw in that checklist or in general regarding WCAG 2.0. I'll take just a minute and address and give you a chance to ask those now. Laura asked the question of, could you address how these differ from the TXVSN checklist? That I can't really answer, so I'm not terribly familiar with that checklist, but maybe somebody else here might be able to address that.
They all come from the same place, so it'll be the same things, just organized in a different way. We organize ours into course website, word processing, spreadsheet, presentation, PDF general, PDF form, and multimedia. And they've had a revamp within the last year where we took out the redundancies and streamlined it. And so that's where we get our TXVSN accessibility guidelines from 508 and WCAG 2. Does that help?
It helped me. That was useful. So it's more by product type than by principle. Interestingly, the current draft of the updated Section 508 guidelines takes kind of a similar approach. It does it by product feature. So it says, like if it has a visual output, it has to do these types of things. If it has some sort of tactile input, like a keyboard input or pushing buttons, it has to do these types of things. If it has audio output, must do these things. So kind of an interesting approach there with what hopefully someday will be the updated Section 508 requirements. Any other questions about WCAG 2.0? Okay, Ashley mentions about hovering over a link. It should, the full URL is required. That I'm not really sure. I don't know. That's not something that's in WCAG 2.0 a requirement. The full URL be presented. That may be an internal requirement that you have. Okay, so Laura asked about if that's only required in the hover state and not necessarily fully presented in the wording of the course. I'm assuming that the answer is yes, but it actually says yes. Okay. Well, if you have any other questions, I'm going to continue on. I'll keep monitoring the chat there. If you do have questions, I want to make sure that on WCAG 2.0 that I address those, and I'll be talking a little bit more about other aspects of WCAG 2.0 as we go along here. But it's just, I think it's important to note that having the checklist can be really helpful to make sure you haven't missed anything big. There are a few things in WCAG 2.0 that are easy to miss in other aspects of evaluation. One example of that is the WCAG 2.0 requires that the document language be specified. So you can, in a web page, identify that it's an English page or a French page, and that would cause a screen reader to read that page with the appropriate language and settings and intonation and things like that. And that can be really easy to miss, even if you do screen reader testing. If you are speak English and are using a standard English screen reader on an English page, you might miss that the language hasn't been identified correctly, or that maybe it's misidentified as being French instead of English, which would cause difficulty for users that are multilingual and their screen reader understands how to speak French. So you know, that's the type of thing that a checklist going through and say, oh, I need to check the language, and taking 10 seconds to check to make sure it's identified correctly can be helpful. Okay, moving on. Mixed in this methodology is check alternative text. Those that were here yesterday are probably sick of me saying content and function as being the things that are conveyed in our alternative text rather than the description of what the image looks like. You ask yourself, is the alt text succinct, yet accurate and equivalent? The vast majority of images, the alternative text will be 1 or 2 words. Very rarely will it be more than that, but there are certainly occasions where the alternative text might be a sentence or 2. Usually if it's much longer than that, you might think of a different way of conveying that information rather than in the alt attribute. It's also important to make sure, and this is a step that's often missed, is you want to make sure the alternative text makes sense in its context. Sometimes we evaluate alternative text simply by looking at the image in isolation of its context. You also need to consider, as a screen reader is reading through a page and it encounters that image, how is that alternative text going to sound? Is it going to make sense in the reading flow of the surrounding content? And that's really important. So you want to consider the location of that image and its alternative text, and that it actually works in the broader context of the page rather than just in isolation. Really important to check functional images. So linked images, buttons, image maps, things like that, to make sure they have proper alternative text. This is often missed, but is very significant for accessibility if you have a functional image that everybody else can see, that everybody else can click on, but if there's not alternative text for it, that's really difficult for a screen reader user. And there's a lot of intricacies to proper alternative text. We went through some of those yesterday. Just know that it can be, in many ways, the most complex aspect of web accessibility and evaluation. Because how does one person know that something is equivalent? There's a lot of judgment call that goes on in determining whether something is equivalent or not. Next in this methodology, this is kind of an interesting test, but is really useful for evaluation. That's to disable styles and linearized tables. A few things happen when you do this. First of all, by disabling the visual styles of a page, it really simplifies the page. It brings it back to its underlying content and structure. So you'd be able to see things like headings and underlying lists and any other markup structure in the page without the visual styling, things like layout and color and sizing and things like that. So this is really helpful. The other thing that it does by disabling styles and linearizing tables, especially if tables are used for layout, is it reveals the underlying reading and navigation order. So you can visually look and see the order in which a screen reader will read content and the order in which keyboard users would navigate through elements within that page. That's really helpful to make sure that the reading order is logical. It also allows you to check if you're relying on color or layout or positioning or other stylistic things to determine, to provide accessibility that may not be accessible to, say, screen reader users or to other users that may override page color or increase text size or disable styles, things like that. And just to make sure that that underlying page structure and markup is useful. I do have the word readable with the question mark on this slide. I bring that up just because in section 508 there's a requirement that says the page is readable when styles are disabled. Well, everything is readable when styles are disabled. It's pretty much impossible to fill that requirement of section 508. I'm not even exactly sure what the intention of that was when it was written in 1999. Nobody really browses the web with styles entirely disabled. So I don't know really what that means. I think the spirit of this is that the user has control over certain visual aspects of their page. They can override colors, they can increase text size, and the page maintains its readability and functionality. Do keep in mind, however, that if you have a complex web application, disabling styles, linearizing tables may not be all that useful, right? If you're dealing with a complex presentation, seeing it in a linearized order can be a little confusing. It does show you that underlying reading and navigation order, but for a complex web app, it's just one of the steps you might want to do in considering the evaluation of the accessibility of it. Okay, Nikki asked the question, if the main text is inside an image and is not explained or addressed in the environment, what should the alt tag look like? I don't know, it's a bit of a complex question. You know, first of all, generally if you have text, particularly like main content text, it usually would be best to not put that in an image. It's assumed that if you're doing that, maybe you're doing it for stylistic reasons. And to maintain that visual presentation. Sometimes we get really hung up on visual presentation when our focus should be on content, getting that content in a really useful way. And we have so much power with CSS these days. A lot of times we can do some really, really nice visual presentation and layout with true text rather than having to put that in an image. So that'd be my first question is I would probably go back to the actual presentation and try to do it in actual text so you don't need to bother with the image or alternative text. But other than that, you know, you would have to provide an equivalent alternative in some way. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the alt attribute for that image. If it's a lot of text, if it's main body text, that could be quite lengthy. And so there might be other ways to do that, an alternative version or maybe off-screen text, some other way for the user to get all of that content. So I can't give you a definitive answer without seeing more of an example, but that's the short version there. Okay. Next in our methodology is testing content scaling. What that means is things increase in size within the page, you ensure that they maintain their readability and functionality. What we recommend is enlarging the text size in your web browser up to maybe about 150%. What that means is instead of zooming the page, you actually increased only the text size. Now, of note in WCAG 2.0 is it says that the page is readable and functional when the text size is increased to 200%, twice as big as normal. That's actually really quite big. It's a lot bigger than you would think. When you actually see it at 200%, it's big. It's really big. But kind of buried in those hundreds of pages of support material for WCAG 2.0, it does in there state that if your page supports Zoom, meaning everything is enlarged rather than just the text, then that's sufficient to pass that WCAG requirement. Well, almost everything passes the Zoom requirement at 200%, meaning if you zoom everything, make it twice as big, everything that's readable at 100% is going to be readable at 200%. Or if it's not very readable at 200%, it's not going to be very readable at 100% either. So congratulations, everybody passes this requirement of WCAG 2.0 because your stuff will be readable at 200% Zoom. With that said, keep in mind that some users don't use Zoom. They increase only their text size. But most users that do that only increase their text size a little bit, maybe to about 150% at most. If I have really low vision and I have to zoom the page to 200%, increase the text size to 200%, I'm not using text sizing. I'm going to be using Zoom or a dedicated screen magnifier to do that. If you're my grandmother, whose vision is not as good as it used to be, she may increase her text size just a bump or two, and you want to make sure that it maintains its readability and functionality at that age. And now it doesn't have to look exactly the same. It can even have horizontal scrolling, and that's fine to pass that. There is a WCAG AAA requirement that says the page can zoom to 200% without horizontal scrolling. Very difficult, especially for complex modern web layouts, but it's a AAA requirement. So test increasing just the text size to maybe 150%, and then zoom the entire page and make sure everything's readable. Particularly with zooming, you would want to look at usually text inside of images is where you may run into issues there. Next, we want to verify our colors and our contrast. So do color contrast testing. This is a tool you'll use in the next activity here. Well, I'll come back to that in just a minute. You may also want to look for issues that can impact color blindness. One tool, I actually didn't put it in here, but I would recommend, we used it yesterday in an activity, is called No Coffee. Yeah, it's kind of a weird name, so No Coffee. What makes a lot of us grumpy, I think, if we were to experience no coffee. But it's an extension for the Chrome browser that allows you to simulate various types of visual disabilities, including color blindness or color deficiency on pages, so you see what your page would look like with various forms of visual disabilities, including color blindness. So it's a neat tool. This colorfilter.wikline.org is a similar tool, focuses only on color blindness. Again, it allows you to see your page as it would be seen with various forms of color blindness. One simple test, it's not really environmentally friendly, is you can print on a grayscale black and white printer. That allows you to do two things. One is allows you to see if there's any color reliance, any color that's being used to convey information or meaning alone, or if there may be contrast issues. They just become a little more apparent when you print in grayscale and lose the color. You can also use the Wave tool, which we'll be using in just a little bit. Has color contrast checking built into it. It is important to note that the actual colors don't really matter, at least for accessibility. Some people say, oh, red and green are bad for accessibility because red-green color deficiency is the most common form of color deficiency. It's actually not true. As long as there's sufficient contrast and you're not relying on those colors, then the actual colors don't matter. At least for accessibility, they do matter a lot for aesthetics. You know, maybe your Christmas theme might use red and green, but you're probably not going to get away with it any other time. You may also want to check high contrast settings. We have a blog post about this. You can, on both Mac and on Windows, you can enable a high contrast mode. It kind of either inverts the colors or changes the colors so there's always high contrast. It's interesting to just test that and see if any information is lost in the presentation of the page when you enable high contrast mode. So the color contrast checker that's available on the WebAIM site, this will be your next activity just to go and explore this and spend some time. I'm going to give just a little bit of an overview of it, at least what it is, and then you can go see how it works and use it on your own. But in WCAG 2.0, there is a formula that is defined that based on a foreground and background RGB color, and hopefully you're familiar with RGB colors. It's just a way of identifying colors within web pages or style sheets on the web. Based on a foreground or background RGB color, 6-digit letter or number value, it will generate a contrast ratio. This formula is really nasty. Okay, you don't want to try to do this math on your own with a calculator. It's a very, very complex formula to determine that contrast ratio. So you want to use tools like this tool that we had built on the WebAIM site to just simply put in the foreground background color and let it do all that math work for you. So it will generate a contrast ratio. In WCAG 2.0, there are different thresholds for compliance. There's a level AA threshold and a level AAA threshold, and the requirement is actually a little different for what they call large text. Large text is defined as 14-point bold text or larger, or 16-point or larger, and I hope I'm remembering those numbers right. Normal text is anything smaller than that. The idea is if it's big and bold, it doesn't have to have as much contrast because it's big and bold. Of interest is there is no single A contrast requirement. White text on a white background is level A WCAG compliant. Totally inaccessible to everybody, and that's another important note to make, is the WCAG addresses disability accessibility. If something is unusable or inaccessible to everybody, WCAG generally doesn't care, right? It only deals with disability. So that might be the argument there, is white text on a white background is inaccessible to everybody, so there's no level A requirement. I don't know. What we're going to do on this next activity is you'll go out, you'll use this contrast checker tool as well as the ColorZilla extension. Hopefully you've installed that. If not, you can maybe take a minute to install ColorZilla. It's an extension for either Firefox or Chrome. It generates a little color picker tool within your web browser. You can click on the color picker and then click on any element within a page, and it sucks out the color value for that, and you can then copy and paste that color value into the contrast checker tool on the WebAIM site and generate the contrast ratio and see whether it's a AA or AAA compliant. So our facilitators will guide you a little bit through that process and contrast checking, and then you'll have some time, I hope, to go play with this on your own and maybe evaluate the contrast of some of your own resources. So with that, we will jump to activity 2.
Chrissy, you'll need to move yourself there. I would pick either lab 2 or 3 because the numbers are lower in there. All right, welcome everyone back to the main room, and we have one last segment for Jared to finish up, and then we'll have our conclusion. So Jared, I hand it over to you.
Okay, I first wanted to see if there were any questions about using those tools or about how WCAG addresses the color contrast. If you want to post those down in the chat, I'd be happy to address those now. One thing to note, I found in one of the rooms I jumped into is someone put the foreground and background colors in backwards. So the actual text color was put in as the background color, and the foreground is the background. So just backwards. It actually doesn't matter. The formula works the same. If you inverse the foreground and background color, it'll give you the same color contrast ratio and results. And Sarah has a fire alarm, so yeah, get out of the building, and we hope you come back safely. Any other questions about how that works? Another thing I mentioned in one of the rooms was that in addition to the color picker tool, you can also use like developer tools, if you're familiar with those. It's a way, most browsers have these built into them, so you can analyze an element and see the underlying styles that are defined for that element. And that would reveal if there's a defined RGB color value for text or for background elements, it would display those, and then you can just copy and paste from there rather than using the color picker. So that'll work for a lot of text and background blocks or elements. It will not, however, work for images. That's where the color picker is really valuable, is in pulling colors out of images. So interestingly, WCAG 2.0 doesn't really tell you how to address things like drop shadows, background gradients, text glow, text borders, things like that. So it's important to use some common sense. This is an example I used yesterday, maybe familiar to some of you, but if you look at those colors, you might think of, see if you can guess which of these colors on the screen pass the WCAG 2.0 AA requirement and which ones fail. So I'll give you just a second to take your best guess as to which ones you think pass or fail. And here's the results. These top 4 pass, the bottom 4 all fail. You notice there's okay, Nikki, she was here yesterday probably, and then knew the right answers. Most people don't get this right, but maybe you're just really good. But yeah, you notice that between the two colors of gray, that there's virtually no difference between those, right? I mean, these two are. I mean, they look almost the same. This one, just the fail one, has just slightly lower contrast than the pass gray text. And so really what WCAG does is it draws a line, right? Anything up here, this side of the line passes. Anything down here, boo, fails. But humans don't work that way. Human accessibility doesn't work that way. It doesn't draw a line. WCAG, however, does have to define a threshold. So use some common sense when you're considering color contrast as to what the actual impact is going to be on the users, and consider the amount of text, the size of the text, things like that in considering the impact. You may want to on your own, and I don't know if you may have done this, but you may consider defining for yourselves maybe like a level A type contrast ratio requirement. The AA ones can be a little bit difficult in some designs and some color schemes to pass. So maybe you set a little lower threshold at level A that you use internally. So anyway, something to consider. Okay, next in our methodology for evaluation is to check keyboard accessibility. Fortunately, this is relatively easy to check. Just put that mouse away. Stop using the mouse or your touchpad and use only the keyboard to navigate through the page. You would use Tab to navigate forward through links and form controls, Shift Tab to navigate backwards, Enter generally to activate something that currently has keyboard focus. Now if you are on a Mac, there may be some additional steps, settings necessary to get Tab and Shift Tab to navigate through all the interactive things on a web page. But generally, that's going to work. So you just want to make sure that all functionality that's available to mouse users is also available via the keyboard. You would want to see if you have a skip navigation or a skip to main content link. This is a link that could be provided at the top of the page to allow the user to bypass the repetitive navigation and jump directly to the main content. You want to make sure that works. You want to make sure that as you navigate that you can visually tell which things have keyboard focus so you can activate those. By default, the browser will draw a dotted line around currently focused links or form controls. That you can, with CSS, you can turn off that focus indicator. That would be essentially render the page totally inaccessible to sighted keyboard users, so don't do that. But the default focus indicator is pretty minimal, you can enhance that focus indicator with CSS. So if you tab through the page, it's more distinct, more visually distinctive as to which thing has keyboard focus. A nice little enhancement for accessibility for sighted keyboard users. It's not required for WCAG 2.0. You just have to have some focus indicator, which the browser does by default unless you turn it off. But you can enhance the accessibility of your page. You also want to make sure that the navigation order as you navigate through that page is logical, that it generally follows the visual presentation order from left to right, top to bottom through the page. Next, check in the screen reader. This is always the part that can be kind of scary for people. It doesn't have to be. Screen readers can be rather complex. What we recommend for most people in their evaluation using a screen reader is to use NVDA. It stands for Non-Visual Desktop Access. It's a free open source screen reader. It's getting better all the time. It's getting more and more full-featured. So we recommend usually NVDA. There's also the JAWS screen reader. JAWS is the most common screen reader in usage right now. However, it's like $1,100 to buy a license for it. So it may not be a suitable option for most of you unless you already have access to the JAWS software. Otherwise, NVDA for Windows. If you're on a Mac, you have VoiceOver. The VoiceOver screen reader comes built into all modern Mac computers as well as all iOS devices. So iPhones, iPod Touch, iPad all have the VoiceOver screen reader built into them. Also improving all the time, but a very good screen reader, especially for basic evaluation. So we have tutorials on our website for all three of those screen readers just to help get you started. With screen readers, there are a lot of keyboard commands because the blind screen reader user isn't generally going to be using a mouse, which is a visual input. They'll be using the keyboard, so there are a lot of keyboard commands to navigate and make that screen reader work. So we highlight in our tutorials those basic keyboard commands, and just enough to get you started. For the most part, really, we recommend two things. First, just go to the page and listen to it. Now, when you're doing your testing, put your mouse away, because screen reader users are going to be using the keyboard, and turn off your monitor or look away from your monitor. Sometimes if you're actually looking at the page while the screen reader is reading it, you hear what you see rather than what was actually spoken to you by the screen reader. So by not looking at it, it can help you get a better sense of the actual screen reader accessibility. So step one, go to the page and just listen to it from top to bottom. Is alternative text present for images? Is the reading order logical? Is there anything that was missing? That type of stuff. Then don't worry about things like pronunciation. If the screen reader pronounces things weird, don't worry about it. That's just the way screen readers work. As long as you've got it all spelled correctly and formatted correctly to where it makes sense visually, screen reader users can usually make sense of that. And then go back, your step two is going to be navigate through the page. Make sure all of your interactive elements, links, form controls, things like that, especially dynamic content if you have scripted content within a page that you can get to and interact with all of that content using just the keyboard. Do keep in mind that screen readers are big, bloated, nasty, ugly, buggy things. Sometimes it is the screen reader's fault. Sometimes they just act weird and have bugs. It's sometimes hard to know, though. Is it your fault? Is the content inaccessible, or is it the screen reader being wonky? Just know that sometimes it's the screen reader's fault. Sometimes testing in multiple screen readers can help you determine if there's a particular issue there. Okay, next in this methodology is validate your HTML and your CSS. Now, valid code supports accessibility. That means that your code is following the rules of HTML and CSS. It's following the specification as it's supposed to be. You can have really, really invalid HTML and CSS code that works fine in browsers. The browsers tend to fix code mistakes in HTML and CSS. They do their best to make it work, even if you give it bad code. But valid code does support accessibility. With that said, it doesn't ensure accessibility. You can have, a web page that's perfectly valid HTML and CSS that's totally inaccessible. On the other hand, you could have an accessible page that has invalid code. That happens all the time. But just know that the valid code supports accessibility. So it's a good idea to test it. Now, WCAG 2.0 does not require perfectly valid standards compliant code. It only requires that you don't screw up too bad. It kind of identifies significant validation issues, things that might impact accessibility as being failures in WCAG 2.0. So there is a W3C validator for both HTML and CSS. I encourage you, beyond just for accessibility reasons, there are a lot of good motivations from a development standpoint for having valid code. It's just cleaner, it's going to work better across browsers, it's going to be more future-proof as browsers improve and become more standards compliant. It's going to be more search engine friendly, and the list goes on. Okay, and then next is user testing. Sometimes people will say, well, how do I best do accessibility testing with people with disabilities? And we say don't. Don't do accessibility testing with people with disabilities. You might be thinking, what? This sounds like heresy. Why would you not want to do accessibility testing with people with disabilities? What we recommend instead is to do usability testing and include people with disabilities. If all that you do is accessibility testing with people with disabilities, first of all, don't do that until you've implemented good accessibility and you've evaluated it and fixed all of these other things we've already talked about. Don't waste someone's time by bringing them in to identify accessibility issues that you can identify using these other methodologies. So that can be really frustrating for that user. So instead of that accessibility testing, if you do just accessibility testing, you're really going to be looking for instances of inaccessibility. Oh, here's an image that doesn't have very good alternative text. Oh, here's a label that's not, or a form that's not appropriately labeled. And that can be helpful, but if you do user testing, you're focusing on a broader user experience, and then you may be implementing tasks along the way. By focusing on that broader user experience, you can still identify those instances of inaccessibility, but you're going to better ensure that the broader user experience is positive for users with disabilities. So there's an article on our website. Steve Krug has an excellent book. It's called User Testing is Not Rocket Surgery, something like that. I can't remember the exact title. It has something to do with rocket surgery and user testing. It's an excellent book. It just outlines a real basic methodology for user testing. It does not have to be expensive, does not have to be complex. And so this article on the WebAIM site just outlines some ways that you can use those same methodologies for accessibility user testing. So including accessibility into that process to ensure good usability and good accessibility. Because when you combine those two together, that's when you have a really good user experience. Okay, and then finally, we have automated tools. This is often where we start with accessibility evaluation. I put it at the end on purpose. We talked about some of the limitations of automated tools. Doing the rest of this is going to get you much closer to determining true accessibility than simply plugging in your site to some automated tool. Now, there are a lot of tools that are out there. There's too many to list. I will mention that accessibility automated tools, online, any software type system to evaluate accessibility is best utilized kind of later in the process, after you've already done a lot of accessibility, especially if you're going to spend money on a tool. We've had clients that have dropped 6 figures on accessibility tools just to find out, oh crap, we have a lot of issues. Now what do we do? And 6 figures would have bought them a lot of good accessibility implementation. Instead, it went towards a tool that simply said, oh, you've got 50,000 accessibility errors on your site. And then they had come up with more budget to actually fix it. So tools have their place. You would, if you're going to spend money on a tool, do that after you already know you've got good accessibility, and use it to help detect changes and introduction of new accessibility issues rather than to simply tell you everything you've got wrong. I promise that if you've got 6 figures to spend to figure out how accessible you are, you can just give it to me and I'll give you a lot better feedback than any automated tool is going to do. So tools really cannot replace good education. They can't replace humans. They're very limited in what they can tell you. So spend all this time talking about the limitations and reasons why you may not want to use tools. But with that said, there are some really good tools out there. We're going to take just a minute and talk about Wave. Now this is found at wave.webaim.org, so it's just the disclosure here. This is a WebAIM tool. It's a tool that we develop and that we provide freely as a community service. So it's entirely free for you to use. The approach with Wave is a little bit different than most evaluation tools. Many evaluation tools you could upload your page or give the tool your site address, and it will give you a text report that outlines accessibility or compliance issues on that page. So it might say something like, on line 427, column 12, you have an image that's missing alternative text. And that can be helpful for somebody that actually understands those line numbers and can understand the technical specification of what that alternative text means and can find it and fix it in the code. The approach with Wave is more of a visual presentation. We take your page, we analyze it, and then we show you your visual page, but inject into that page icons and indicators that give feedback about accessibility and usability. Also, our approach with Wave is to facilitate human evaluation. So rather than simply telling you what we think is right or wrong with accessibility, we do that, but we also identify or flag things within a page that would necessitate human evaluation, and we structure the presentation to facilitate that evaluation. So instead of simply saying, hey, here's an image that has alternative text, or an image that's missing alternative text, or maybe has inappropriate alternative text, we show you the actual image and show you the alternative text in conjunction with that image, so you can see the alternative text in place with that image, and then you can determine for yourself whether it is appropriate alternative text or not. No tool can do that. No tool can tell you if the alternative text is appropriate. Only a human can do that, so we make it easier for humans to do that type of evaluation. And that's just one example of the many things that Wave tries to do with this, but rather than kind of explain Wave more, we're just going to go to activity 3 and let you go out and explore it a little bit. As before, if you come across any questions you have about the tool, hold on to those. When you come back into the main room here in about 12 minutes, I'll take some time to answer those. So, activity 3.
Laura, if you get moved out and then you come back in to get kicked out, you have to move yourself into a room. You just click on your name and drag yourself over into one of the open rooms. Lab 2 has less people, so you might move into that one. If you'd like, Laura, I'd be happy to move you into Lab 2 if you would like me to. Laura, can you type in the chat? I hate to see you miss out on the practice time, and we'd be happy to move you. Well, I'll go ahead and move you just in case maybe you're just not able to type. Sometimes it kind of locks up on us.
All right, welcome everyone back to the main room again, and we have one last little bit, and Jared will conclude. So I'll hand it back to Jared.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. So really just in summary here, these are all the items that we talked about for evaluating. There's probably more that you can do, but this gives you a good process, a good methodology, things to remember in evaluation that are going to give you a good idea of how accessible something actually is. Throw in some good common sense with that, and you're going to be experts in evaluating web accessibility. I want to talk just real briefly just about documenting issues. Some things that we do, you know, if you're evaluating a site and you want to document issues, you can structure that by page. So, you know, this page has these issues, this page has these issues. You could structure it maybe by guideline or success criteria. So these are all of the instances of pages that are missing, instances of missing alternative text. You could also do it by severity. These are the highest severity issues. These ones have less of an impact. So a lot of flexibility there on how you structure a report. And WebAIM does all of these just depending on the best match for the site we're evaluating. We also, in our evaluations, provide what we call a severity ranking of each individual issue. WCAG levels just don't really work very well for this. For instance, you can have one image that's missing alternative text that has no impact on end user accessibility, or say a critical form button that's missing alternative text that has huge impact on the accessibility of a page. But both are level A failures. They're treated equally in WCAG 2.0. So we provide a severity rating that says, hey, this particular issue has this level of impact on end user accessibility. And we often will, often in our documentation, use the words must, should, or may to give an idea of how critical it is that a particular issue be addressed. So you must do this, you should do this, or you may do this, to give some measure of necessity for implementing a fix for accessibility. And make sure in your documentation that you go beyond accessibility issues. With that, I'm going to say thank you. I only have just a couple minutes before my next session starts. If there are questions, I will monitor those here for just a minute, but then I actually need to reboot, go to Windows, and everything else in 10 minutes to be back for the next session on Microsoft Word accessibility. So I'll say thanks, and I'll stick around for just a minute if there are any questions.
All right, and here's our conclusion slide. The recording should be available tomorrow, and also your CPE certification and participation. If you log in tomorrow and you look under reports, it should be there. And those things will be available till next year's conference in July. And I wanted to thank everyone, Connie Swiderski for organizing, Jared for presenting, Joy for being our aide, and Becky for having the fingers of fire, trying to keep up with all the fast talking. She's been our captionist. Good job, Becky. I was watching that, and she's really good. I'd like to thank you all for attending and having such great questions and participation. And I'll probably see some of you in the next session here that Jared was just about to go to. Oh, thanks, Sarah.